Boring is great, and that is what the iPhone 11 illustrates perfectly. At its core, the iPhone 11 is an iPhone XR with an extra camera and a slightly faster CPU. But it's also a lot more than that. When I looked at the XR last year, I complained about Apple clearly stripping features out to keep the price down. But now with the 11, it's clear that those features were never needed in the first place. Instead, this iPhone keeps nothing but the necessities, and because of that, and some other reasons, I think this is the only new iPhone that you should consider buying. The design of the iPhone 11 is among one of my favourites of any new phone that we've seen in the past few years. It's minimal, with the centered Apple logo and no iPhone branding being one of the best decisions Apple have made recently, but things like the extruded and matte finished camera bump gives a clean look to both of this phone's cameras and place them well within the back of the phone. In a market where new design styles come out every day, this phone keeps it simple, and that's all I want. Weighing in at just under 200 grams and with an even weight distribution and brilliant ergonomics, using this phone for anything is pleasing throughout. There's something about this phone that ticks all of the boxes for me. I try and keep things minimal in most aspects of my life, and this phone fits that really well. The display on iPhone 11 has me divided in opinion. An LCD panel isn't the best decision Apple could have made for this device, as it simply doesn't look as good as the OLED display on the 11 Pro series, or even on the XS and the 10. But that doesn't mean this phone has a bad display by any means. One part of me loves it, as for everyday use it is a fantastic panel, but the other part of me misses having an OLED display. It's still great for colour accuracy and it has a fantastic viewing experience, but it just simply could be a little bit better. But that being said, there are easy workarounds within iOS to avoid some of the unpleasantness that LCDs bring. And speaking of things that are fast and reliable, what better way to showcase your work than with a bespoke built website from Zyro, today's sponsor. Perfect for a professional portfolio, online store, or literally anything in between. Everything with Zyro is drag and drop, and you don't need to bother with coding anything. With dozens of bespoke templates to choose from, getting started is easy, and they're all fully customizable so your site can be uniquely yours. Building a site with Zyro is as simple as dragging and dropping elements onto your page, like your favourite photos, products that you're going to sell, or anything that you create. With features like an AI predicted heat map, text recommendations, and logo creations, Zyro takes the difficulty out of site building and puts the creative customization right at your fingertips. And best of all, you can get published within less than an hour of creating your account. I don't see anyone else making things that simple. With an intuitive, logical, and easy to use layout, Zyro can be the launchpad you need to get yourself out there. Sign up now at the link in the description and use the code TechFocus for 30% off any of their paid plans. The only time I found this display to be visually unappealing was during the first few weeks of using this phone, where I had iOS on dark mode. With that enabled, it's a lot clearer how different this display is to that of the OLED within the iPhone X, which I was using recently. And it bugs me. This phone costs £729, which is almost the price of a OnePlus 8 Pro, and even with a reasonable Apple Premium added, on top of a realistic price for all the hardware here, an LCD display really doesn't belong on this phone. Just after its launch, there was a bit of a fuss about 828p as its resolution, but it's really not something you notice at all. By keeping every device to 326 ppi, Apple have found a great balance of resolution and battery saving capability. At a normal distance from your eyes, you can't see pixels at all, but if you look close enough, they will be visible. This display is more than great enough for most users, from watching YouTube videos to Netflix to whatever streaming service, because there's about 18 million of them out now. It's absolutely brilliant. Although it wasn't an essential feature, I do miss 3D touch. iOS 13 has introduced better timings for holding the previous 3D touch enabled menus and controls, so it seems a bit pointless to want it when the difference is barely noticeable, but occasionally I activate the torch or open the camera in my pocket because it doesn't recognise force anymore, it just recognises time, and sometimes it can be easy to trigger those things. 3D touch was one of those expensive features to add to a phone that only added a tiny benefit to user experience, so it makes sense for it to be left out. Apple's revisions of Face ID have been nothing but a success. Face ID is incredibly good on the iPhone 11. Paired with Apple's slick animations, it's not only reliable, but it's really smooth too. I've noticed that the range of Face ID works a lot better than I expected, so hands-free notification reading on my desk works great, and even from quite far away. I never expected to like Face ID as much as I do, but it's honestly easier to tap to wake and swipe up than to hold your finger on a scanner. Of course, there's situations where Face ID requires a bit more head movement than you'd like, but this can work both ways with a fingerprint scanner, where sometimes you don't want to pick up your phone to read your notifications. It's the simplicity and the integration of features like Face ID that makes this phone so great to me. After all, the little details are what take a device to a whole new level, and Apple know that by now. The idea of focusing on the little details applies all the way through this phone's software. iOS 13 has brought iOS into real competition with Android devices, offering speed boosts for older devices and system-wide changes like dark mode and custom keyboards. And on the iPhone 11 there is no better software that could suit this phone than iOS 13. The simplicity of multitasking, the logical placement of everything from the settings to the music controls on the lock screen, iOS is at a point where there's not much to complain about at all. As long as you aren't looking for features like custom launchers, icon packs and UI skins, iOS will be a pleasant experience for you. It is argued that iOS is a little bit functional and a bit restrictive, and I can agree with that because there's very little customization on main windows like the home screen, but for me, I really don't have an issue with that. I enjoy using every aspect of iOS. I think half the reason why people like iOS is that it is unapologetically itself, and I don't think it needs the deeper customization like Android has for it to be great. It's supposed to be different. What really makes iOS for me is the seamless animations, and it's something that ties the device together so well. In my 2 months with this phone, I haven't experienced a single moment of lag, stuttering, or anything of the sort. And that's expected. A 2019 phone with Apple's most powerful chip inside, I'd be concerned if there were performance issues. But multitasking between 5 and 6 apps works without a scratch. The A13 is fast, and maybe even a little overkill, but that's fine as it gives the phone headroom for the future. As software gets heavier and batteries age, this phone should hold up well. RAM management can get a little aggressive from time to time, but that's expected from any phone. I found that active multitasking doesn't result in background app closures very often, but occasionally it'll throw one in there just to keep you alert. But it's eased by the incredible app opening speeds that the A13 chip offers, to the point where app closures in the background really aren't that much of a big deal at all. Battery performance is another area in which this phone shines. Amazingly, despite having an LCD panel, I can get between 5 and 6 hours of screen on time before the phone needs to be recharged. That means a whole day's worth of music and social networking and a little bit of entertainment is more than possible with this phone, which is all my use cases really been throughout this lockdown. Apple's native apps are great, but what separates iOS into perfection for me is that third-party apps follow a very similar set of rules for their interfaces, which leads to such a great cohesion between first-party apps and third-party apps. And on top of that, many apps feel a lot better developed for iOS than they ever did for Android. An example of this is Spotify, where gesture input for queuing or removing from your liked songs is a key element, but that's something that's barely even present on the Android version. And there are more examples of this, particularly in the past with Google Apps, Instagram, and most noticeably, Snapchat. Many tech YouTubers say that iOS has the best camera app of any phone on the market, and I can agree to an extent. Everything you need to change, like live photos, timers, and the aspect ratio, is all there and it's easy to use. But a camera app is only as good as the cameras that it's shooting with, and sadly the selfie camera on this phone is a little bit disappointing. Each photo that's taken has a noise reduction blurriness to it, which becomes more apparent as you zoom in. It's something that I may be more sensitive to, as my time with Pixel phones may have ruined every other phone for me, but even if that's the case, this is just my opinion. Luckily, the colours are good, and the camera has a 23mm lens, so it's wide enough for group selfies. It's just a little bit too soft for my liking. But thankfully for the rear cameras, a lot of this isn't the case. Or at least just for the standard lens. The 12MP 26mm camera produces good looking images in the standard mode, and although they can occasionally seem a little bit over sharpened, I've been pleased with the vast majority of photos from this camera. Lens flares are a bit of an issue as pointed out by the early adopters of this phone, but worst of all, bright lighting and varied colours seem to confuse the post-processing, like this shot with my cat as the subject, where something clearly didn't work out well in the post-processing. Thankfully, this doesn't happen very often, and most of the time I'm really pleased with the photos out of this camera. The portrait mode is a little bit lacking if I'm honest, and although Apple have made big steps from the last generation, it struggles to produce a decent looking image even under ideal conditions. And it comes down to edge detection, which isn't amazing, possibly because of the lack of a telephoto lens. And it's something that needs a little bit of work to match the standard of even the cheapest Pixel phone. Night mode is great and it will automatically enable when the exposure gets low enough, and with an option that appears for a custom shutter speed, you could even attempt astrophotography. The wide-angle 12MP 13mm camera is the one I have some issues with. Apart from the barrel distortion, which was inevitable with a lens this wide, other problems occur because of the phone's post-processing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a photo like this looks absolutely disgusting from this camera. It's beyond reasonable levels of editing. It's like a bad HDR result from every photo that's taken with a subject in it. And I find myself avoiding the wide lens for subject photography, and instead it works really well for landscapes. But if you're planning on ever using the wide angle lens for subject photography, I really don't recommend it. Now, one of the biggest areas in which this phone shines is its video recording functionality. iPhones have had a pure monopoly on smartphone videos for a couple of years now, with arguably the best shooting options all the way from 4K 60 to 1080p at 240. And with excellent stabilization paired with a decent microphone that sounds like this, as well as the ability to change cameras mid-shot, it really can't get any better. So shooting photos and videos from this phone is great. The ties between the hardware and the software within the camera app are really quite good. This applies not only to the flexibility of the cameras, but I would also say the rest of the phone too. It's simple on the surface, but it has so many additions to the software and hardware that result in the perfections to it that you don't even notice at first. Because despite the little flaws and the shortcomings that this phone has, and don't get me wrong, it definitely has some, they're all small pieces of a much larger product that this phone is. It's not technically Apple's greatest iPhone, but it's the closest thing to a perfect iPhone that you can buy that will last. This iPhone combines the best features of the Pro line with only a few omissions and a massively dropped price tag to create a device that is essentially my new favourite phone.